Now here's a very key question. So as far as man and land animals are concerned, that's the key question. Well, what about the water? Okay, believe in a worldwide flood, but where are land animals and man? Well, let's go check it out. Plausibility again. Don't just ignore the question because you don't want to consider it. Let's consider it and rule it out. Have we ruled out a worldwide flood yet? No. Okay, as far as land animals and man are concerned, their greater mobility would have enabled most of them to escape temporarily to higher ground as the waters rose, only occasional individuals being swept away and entombed in the sediments. Eventually, of course, the floodwaters overtook even those who had fled to the highest elevations. But in most cases, these men and animals would not be buried but simply drowned and then carried away by the waters on or near the surface until finally decomposed by the elements. Certain spectacular exceptions to this rule might occur when groups of animals huddled together in a cave or on some hillside or on a summit, and they were swept away by a sudden sediment-laden wave of water to be buried en masse in another place. Even after the first 40 days, when the greatest of the rains and upheavals diminished, the scriptures say that the waters prevailed upon the earth for 110 days longer. This statement, together with what one might infer from the prevalent unique meteorologic conditions during that period, with the universal ocean still reacting to the great dynamic imbalance so recently imposed on the earth, would certainly imply that extensive hydraulic and sedimentary activity continued for a long time, with many earlier flood deposits perhaps re-eroded and reworked. Some sediments may well have been transported and deposited several times before reaching their final resting place. Critics maintain that the rise and fall of waters of the Mosaic deluge, in other words, the Noahic flood, about which Moses wrote in Genesis, are described to have been gradual and of short duration, and that they would have produced comparatively little change in the surface of the country that they overflowed, i.e. that the flood period was a tranquil one. However, today, when the continents and oceans are in a state of equilibrium, there are tremendous oceanic currents. One of these, the South Equatorial Current, carries 6 million tons of water a second northwards across the equator. But how much more powerful must the currents have been when the oceanic waters, impelled onward by the breaking up of the fountains of the great deep and suddenly swollen by the opening of the windows of heaven, rose above the highest mountains in the earth within a period of 40 days, and then after 5 months began to return from off the earth continually? Nelson indicates clearly that the impossibility of the tranquil theory as follows: as the sea began to rise, each twice daily current could come higher and higher up the rivers and valleys, spreading further and further wider and inland each time, and then would recede. In places, doubtless, the incoming movements would be as fierce and violent as in the Bay of St. Michael on the mouth of the Amazon, and even more so. The directions of the tidal currents and their violence would change with the changing contours of the surfaces being encroached upon. We do not say that the flood was brought on by a gradual rising of the sea bottoms, though it may have been so, but that being the gentlest manner in which the universal deluge could be brought about, shall we, in view of what we know of tides, so there could be a universal flood and no violence be done to the earth? No. Can we think that it is possible that there were no currents and no movements, no motions of the waters back and forth and hither and yon? Absolutely not. Even the relatively small amounts of water involved in river floods have caused damage that staggers the imagination. Bridges, houses, immense boulders, trees torn up, swept along as mere pebbles and matchsticks. Such floods seldom attain a depth of more than a few dozen feet, and their main force is expended within a few days or hours. But when we begin to speak in terms of a flood that grew mightily upon the earth and prevailed upon the earth 150 days and covered it all, the high mountains which are under all the heavens, we must face the fact that we are no longer dealing with phenomena that are familiar to modern science. It therefore cannot be denied that a universal flood must of absolute necessity have been accomplishing a vast amount of geologic work in a relatively short period of time. Erosion and sedimentation must have taken place on a gigantic scale. Previous isostatic adjustments of whatever sort they were must have been entirely unbalanced by the great complex of hydrostatic and hydrodynamic forces unleashed in the floodwaters, resulting very likely in great telluric terrestrial movements. Associated with the volcanic phenomena and the great rains must also have been tremendous tidal effects, windstorms, and a great complexity of currents, cross-currents, whirlpools, and other hydraulic phenomena. After the floodgates were restrained and the fountains of the great deep stopped, there must still have been for a long time more geologic work accomplished as the masses of water were settling into new basins in the earth, and the earth was adjusting itself to new physiographic and hydraulic balances. Loopholes insist that note should be taken of the tremendous geological possibilities that lie behind the breaking open of the fountains of the great deep. The vastness of these eruptions must be in proportion to the actual depth of the flood. Consider all that weight, 64 pounds per cubic foot, I think it is, down miles. How much weight could that? Of course rock's going to form. And he adds further with regard to the significance of Genesis 7:18-20 for modern science. What opportunity for working vast geologic changes lie dormant in these mighty waters? The native force of Gapar is enhanced by one meodith, exceedingly in verse 18, those are Hebrew words, and by the doubling of the same adverb. That's the Hebrew superlative in verse 19. When will geologists begin to take notice of these basic facts? If they're evolutionists, never. But now we must consider the all-important question of the sequence of deposition of these stratified beds. This supposed order has been made the basis of the accepted system of geochronology and historical geology. It is the backbone of the theory of organic evolution, with its purported display of gradual development of all forms of creatures from simple beginnings through the various geological ages as supposedly shown in the fossils contained in the sedimentary rocks. One point. Things sink in the water and deposit themselves in water based on sphericity. How much like a sphere is it? And density and size. So we see that often. Just take a jar, big jar of water, so you can see through the jar. Put all kinds of different items in it of different sphericity, different size, and different density. And you see they all deposit within those three rules. That's what happened. So, gradual development of all forms and creatures from simple beginnings through the various geological ages is not in view then, as supposedly shown in the fossils contained in the sedimentary rocks. Thus, the very plainest testimony to the great event of the flood, in which the world that then was being overflowed with water, perished. 2 Peter 3:6. It has been transformed instead into a supposed rock record of gradual organic evolution. Absurd. We've somehow swallowed it. We have already noted, however, at some length that this record proves extremely fragmentary and contradictory upon closer examination. It has been shown that the supposed divisions between the various systems are far more often non-existent. We have pointed out that anything approaching the complete geologic column is never found at any one place on the Earth's surface, but only one or a very few systems at most. Even those that are found at a given locality quite commonly have one or more important systems missing, as compared with the supposed standard column, often without any physiographic evidence that the supposed intervening period of erosion and non-deposition ever really occurred. And it is not at all unusual for strata to be found completely out of the approved order, with the old strata resting conformably on top of the young strata. And all of this, as we have repeatedly emphasized, bears extremely hard on the theory of uniformity and the geologic ages and the passage of time. Worldwide flood, recent creation. But it is just what one would expect in the light of the biblical record. In some areas would be deposited one assemblage of sediments, and in other areas entirely different assemblages, depending on the source areas and directions of the deposition currents. Sometimes the flood goes this way, lots of deposits. Then it comes back this way, more deposits. Similar, but not the same. Completely changes the ages idea. if you went by what you actually saw, but it's just what one would expect in the light of the biblical record. Further, how many geologists have pondered the fact that lying on the crystalline basement are found from place to place not merely Cambrian, but rocks of all ages? So was there a really Cambrian rock age or not? This seems to be a rhetorical question because neither speaker nor anyone else seems to attempt to answer it. It seems incapable of satisfactory explanation on the basis of orthodox geology, although speaker seems somehow to think it is to be evidence of extreme uniformity of geologic processes in space and time. Wow. Was he wearing blinders? Actually, of course, it is perfectly consistent with the flood record. Yes. It's interesting to note, in passing, that even if the Cambrian rocks were accepted as actually the oldest of the fossil-bearing strata, the problem of evolution would still be far from solved. As Ladd says, most paleontologists today give little thought of fossiliferous rocks older than the Cambrian, thus ignoring the most important missing link of all. Indeed, the missing Precambrian record cannot properly be described as a link, for it is in reality about 9/10 of the chain of life. The first 9/10 has the most stuff in it, yet let's ignore it because it's out of place. Similarly, T. and George says, granted an evolutionary origin of the main groups of animals and not an act of special creation, the absence of any record whatsoever, a single member of any of the phyla in the Precambrian rocks remains an inexplicable, unorthodox grounds as it was to Darwin. So Darwin didn't know, nobody knows since. But he says, granted an evolutionary origin of life. Was he drinking? All of these biblical inferences from the flood record are clearly supported in at least a general way by the actual records of the rocks. Almost all the sedimentary rocks on the earth, which are the ones containing fossils and from which are the supposed geologic history of the earth, has been largely deduced to have been laid down by moving waters. This statement is so obvious and so universally accepted that it needs neither proof nor elaboration. Sedimentary rocks, by definition, are those that have been deposited as sediments by water, which the Oxford Universal Dictionary defines as earthly, detrital, worn away by erosion, matter deposited by aqueous agency. Aqueous meaning water. I prefer the word water. Obviously, these great masses of sediments must first have been eroded from some previous location, transported, and then deposited, perhaps, of course, more than once. Exactly the same sort of thing which occurs in any flood, and which we have seen must have occurred on a uniquely grand scale during the great flood of Genesis. Okay, at least let's rule out a worldwide flood, or even large local floods. They don't even consider the point, but it screams, hey, how did we get these deposits? Water, not oil. People say that the earth just looks old when you see all of those bedded geological structures, and everybody knows that it takes millions and millions of years to form the fossils and all those layers, and so it has to be old. But invariably, we will find that all those geological processes are extremely rapid in spite of what's taught in many of the textbooks. For example, the standard for how long it takes to form limestone is 2,700 years to form a foot of limestone back in the so-called Paleozoic area, and at least 2,400 years back in the so-called Cenozoic. And so if that's the case, and we've got many thousands of feet of limestone, then obviously the earth is very old. But where do these conclusions come from? Obviously no one watched for 2,700 years to see a foot of limestone form. Wow. And what we actually find is that this is based on the assumption that the earth is old. Assuming the age of a particular formation, then they divide the age into the rocks. How old are the rocks? Well, let's go see. Then they come up with so many feet per thousands of years. And so it is the assumption that determines the rate, the sedimentation rate, not observation. But we look at the strata, and those who study stratigraphy know that it has to be formed slowly. The rocks look like they took that long to form. No, that's really the opposite of the truth. Consider the statement in the book Principles of Stratigraphy by Dunbar and Rogers, one of the leading textbooks used in colleges across the country to study stratigraphy or the strata of the layers. Use of the lead-uranium ratio, however, soon demonstrated its age to be more than 2 million years. And that's based on the assumption previously discussed. Is that what they expected?